Great talk by Yogesh. So I wanted to share some more thoughts about generative AI, where we are in this journey, and where the innovation is taking place. I'm Rayn Veerubhotla. I lead the partner engineering function at Google Cloud. So we work to onboard partners onto our platform and to co-innovate with partners. When you look at Gen AI, the first question to ask is, why is there so much of hype? The fundamental answer here is it enables the business user to be productive directly. Let's take some examples. All of us are tired of looking these large 60-page contracts to figure out those nuggets, 4 bits of information that's relevant to me as a business user. Well, Gen AI can summarize in seconds. So I don't have to go through this 70-page document. I can actually look at 2-3 points that are relevant for me. There's some great use cases coming along. Yogesh touched on some of them. We're working with Workday to automatically create job descriptions that are relevant for a given search. We are working with UKG to get a set of questions based on the job description that are specific and without any bias. There are a ton of use cases. In fact, McKinsey did a study of generative AI. Their assessment is it creates 4.4 trillion of value to the economy. T with a trillion. Majority of it, about 70%, will come from productivity improvements, what I talked about, how business users can be really more productive. Rest 30% is about creating new scenarios, new business processes that didn't exist before. So every industry is literally going through this paradigm shift. Yogesh touched on some of the industries. Let me give you some more examples. If you look at financial services, previously wealth management services were only limited to a small set of wealthy individuals. What Gen AI is doing is democratizing that process. The companies are able to bring wealth management down to a small investor level. That's fundamentally changing the TAM for the financial services companies. There's a ton of great work going on in anti-money laundering, in applying Gen AI for detecting fraud use cases. If you look at retail, what is the fundamental problem in retail and CPG companies today? They don't have an effective way to run a campaign. Case in point, most of the emails sent by a retailer or a CPG company end up going into trash, junk email. Why? Because those are form letters. The holy grail in retail is marketing to an audience of one, marketing specifically to one consumer at a time. Well, Gen AI helps you do that. You can now connect Gen AI to your loyalty system and create a custom targeted campaign for one consumer at a time. Mr. Consumer, you were in my store last Friday. You bought this red sweater. Now we have shoes that go along with it. If you come into our store the next week, we will give you X% off. That is a much different world for retailers than where we are before. In health sciences, it's all about drug discovery, reducing the time to bring a drug to the market, and accelerating clinical trials. I can go on and on. One thing that I did not mention here is the core technology companies. Code generation through Gen AI is fundamentally changing the productivity dynamics. It's not about generating more code. It's also about generating code that's free of vulnerabilities and it's more performant. And Gen AI helps you do that. I'll give you some stats from Google experience down the line. So all this is great, fantastic. 4.4 trillion of value, all these fantastic use cases, but they come with set of risks, especially in an enterprise environment. So the big division that I want to bring up right up front is generative AI for consumer use cases is very different than generative AI for enterprises. We have completely two different solutions to address this. If you're looking at consumer space, how do I create a recipe or plan my trip to Italy next week? Those are very different use cases because there's no proprietary data. There is the precision and recall can be much less. You're much more tolerative to wrong answers that the search engine gives you. It's a different world. When you talk about enterprises, things like IP protection become paramount. How do I protect to make sure my crown jewels, my data, does not get leaked because I use Gen AI? You never want to have a Samsung moment or an Italian government moment where you realize your internal data got compromised because you fed it into a LLM to do a query. Very fundamental. Of course, you never want to get sued also that the data that was used to train the LLM, you don't know that it infringed someone else's IP, and there's a ton of cases going on right now around IP infringement. If you look at on the technology side, in an enterprise use case, you never want your model to hallucinate, go beyond its abilities. You need ways to control hallucinations. God behold, you're a financial services company and you have a chat bot and the LLM started hallucinating, and essentially you ended up getting sued because it gave a wrong answer to your consumer. You never want that situation. You need ways to manage hallucinations. You need ways to manage biased inputs. You don't want to harm any particular part of the society. Lack of truth function is pretty important too, because Gen AI allows you to create deepfakes that are almost real. How do I make sure I'm actually talking to the real user, not a deepfake of that user, and there's no scam going on here? These risks are pervasive. They cut across. And this is the key point I want to make. For consumer use cases, we have a solution called BART, which is very different in Google's case than the enterprise use cases. We have an enterprise platform called Vertex that is meant to address each of these risks. Unless you address these risks, Gen AI is a non-starter in the enterprise scenarios. Right? So for most of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the enterprise use cases. If there are any questions on the consumer side, I can take that later. I'm sure we can talk about it in any break. So let me dig into the enterprise use cases. How is Google addressing all those risks in AI, and what are we doing to enable enterprises to actually use this technology? Well, it's a very well-known fact that we have been at it for a number of years. The whole generative AI journey, what you see today, started with Google. In 2015, we had the Transformer paper that we open sourced. And that is the basis of everything that you see in generative AI today, including our competitors. That was a start for the generative AI journey. We have been putting tremendous amount of core research in making this better over the years. You've probably heard of our models called PaLM. There's a Gemini set of models coming up. We've been at it with 3,000 plus research. Most of the core IP really came from Google here. And let me explain how with this IP, we address each of those concerns that I talked about, risks that I talked about generative AI. So first and foremost is for a generative AI to work, you need a complete platform. A single LLM, large language model, will not cut it. In an enterprise context, for example, you need MLOps, you need LLM ops so that you can move a model from dev, test to production. All of you who are in IT will appreciate this. It's quite an involved process, the whole DevOps process. The equivalent in ML world is MLOps or LLM ops. You need to have ways to maintain the temperature, model accuracy, make sure there's no model drift. You need a bunch of tools to really bring these to production. Just having a LLM is a start. So we built this entire platform which is specific to bringing GenAI to enterprises. Again, the key here is think about a platform, not just a single LLM. That's the key message. Of course, it starts with a bunch of models. The other key belief that Google has is one model will not cut it all. Meaning, if you have a single model, GPT-3, GPT-4, whatever, it has a limited use because of its size and the way it's trained. It's a generalist, not a specialist. In enterprise use cases, you need specialized models to increase higher accuracy, to make sure the models are performant. You don't want models to be huge with trillions of parameters that will cost you an arm and a leg to run, even infer using that. You need a model that's optimized that will give you the cost envelope that you're looking for. So we do not believe in one model. We have multiple models given a use case. We use Text Bison for text. We use MedPalm for medical type research. It's trained on medical data. By the way, there is some article recently that said MedPalm passed the USMLE exam flying colors on first attempt, which is impressive. It's one of the toughest exams out there. Doctors would know passing USMLE is not a trivial task. We have something called SecPalm for security industry. Your logs are ingesting a ton of security parameters. How do you make sense out of that? How do you take these security logs and figure out what the vulnerabilities are? There's a specialized model for it. Essentially, we believe that you need multiple models, each targeted to do a given function. That's where maybe we are fundamentally different from the rest of the market. And by the way, in Google Cloud, it's not only just our models. We have a model garden. You can bring any model from outside, even non-Google model. You could bring Llama from Facebook. You could, any combination, any open source model. And we have the infrastructure, GPUs, and our own hardware called Tensor Processing Unit, which is very optimized for AI performance in running our data centers. So we have the entire platform. I talked about the key risks. One of the first risks that I talk about is how do I protect the data of the enterprises? As a CIO, how can I be sure that my data, when I'm using this generative AI, is not getting compromised? Fundamental question every customer asks me when I start. So we have an architecture, probably the only architecture in the industry, that 100% assures you that. The customer data is always in customer tenant. We do not pull the data across to Google. Even Google has no access to customer data. It sits in customer tenant. And our LLM is frozen. Even when it interacts, when you send a query, when you send a prompt to our LLM, we do not store it, nor do we do anything with it. So you can be assured that we are not using your data to train our model at all. Right? That is the fundamental assurance that the enterprises are asking for. We even indemnify customers. I can talk about that more in detail. But that is a key differentiator. And one of the key things that I get asked, I never want to have that Samsung moment where I put data to train using a LLM from a third party, and I ended up enriching the LLM with my data, which you never want to do. You want to keep your data internally. Google doesn't want your data. We have plenty of that. We want to make sure your data is protected and in your tenant. I can go into a lot of the other details about how do we embed this into enterprise security. It has to be done at scale. You're talking about production deployment. These are not POCs anymore. It has to mesh into your CMEX, for example, customer managed encryption keys. It has to manage the DMZs. And you have to have the platform that I talked about to do all of this at scale. So let me talk about some customer examples. By the way, I can go into a lot more technical detail if you're interested, how we manage hallucinations. We believe in a technology called grounding and retrieval augmented generation, RAG. Essentially, you ground your model to a set of facts and let LLM work based on the facts that you provided. What's good about that? You can now force the LLM to give priority to the data that you trust, rather than the data that was trained on that you don't know where it came from, right? Also, the data that LLM was trained on is not current. It's probably 1 or 2 years old. Doesn't matter whose LLM you're talking about. It was trained with 1 or 2 year old data. How do you make sure it's actually the results are picking up from the latest data set? That is the RAG technology, retrieval augmented generation. A lot of these things are pioneered by Google. I'm happy to talk to you at a more technical detail level, how we solve that. Let's look at some customer examples. These are real-life examples. The data came from Nielsen. They did a survey of customers who are actually using GenAI today. So I'm not talking about proof of concepts. I'm not talking about hypothetical use cases. I'm talking about actual customers using today. What sort of benefits are they getting? One of the obvious ways to implement GenAI is for your call centers. And what is the business problem I'm trying to solve in a call center? Make the call center analyst much more productive so that they can take more calls. So Nielsen research shows that the agents are 14% more productive. That is significant, by the way. Those of you who run large call centers, 14% improvement in productivity means hundreds of less call center agents. If you're talking about a Verizon and you get 100,000 calls a day, that is a significant number that goes to your bottom line. But that's not all. The story is much more powerful with GenAI. While the agent is much more productive, the answers they give back to the customers are much more relevant. So the NPS goes up. The customer sat goes up. And that is the true story, more than the 14% improvement. I talked about organizations using GenAI for code generation. We are doing that internally at Google too. We have seen tremendous productivity improvements. One of the things that I'm an engineer by trade, one of the things that most developers hate or engineers hate is starting from scratch with a new coding project. It's much easier if I have 80% kind of figured out in a template given to me and I can make the 20% code changes and move into production. The hardest thing is to write something from scratch. GenAI solves this. It gives you that 80% template to start with. By the way, one of the things that people worry about when you do this is, do you have enough watermarking? Do you have enough of lineage on how LLM is suggesting that code? That's very important. Some hacker somewhere put some crazy code in the public domain that your LLM was trained on. You have no idea what it's trained on. And now when you ask it to code, it's just replicating the code from the hacker. You never want situations like that. So when you use GenAI for code generation, you got to be damn sure where it's getting that data from. It has to give you citations. Otherwise, don't trust what GenAI generates. If it doesn't, in general, one of the things that I preach to customers is use GenAI with citations. If it's giving you an answer, the model has to tell you where and how it got to that. Otherwise, the data is suspect, especially in a case where it was trained with general purpose data out there in the public domain. A lot of it is good, a lot of it is bad too. And you don't want to get stuck with the wrong set of data. So when we use this with programmers, Nielsen's data says that it's 126% more effective, meaning a developer is able to develop the code much faster. But again, that's not the whole story. Once the code is developed, I could use GenAI to do vulnerability assessments to make sure there are no security leaks in my code. I can test if my code is performance testing. There's a ton of other add-ons that come with GenAI beyond sheer productivity improvements. One of the most common use cases for Gen AI is content generation, right? Asking it to generate a marketing collateral, marketing document, or document of any nature. This is, that Jasper has been there with a lot of other third parties. Pretty obvious use case. I think already most of you, I'm assuming, have tried this in some form or fashion and are using it. This is obviously a game changer for a marketing professional. If most of my content is pre-made, my website template is pre-made, now I can create a campaign much faster. What used to take months to create a new marketing campaign, you could do it in days now. Because most of the data is pre-generated by Gen AI, you're taking a look at it, and you're solving whatever little tweaks that you need to do, and voila, it's there. Right? They talk about 60% improvement in productivity there. So a ton of great use cases. The value is clear. The technology is here to stay. It's a once-in-a-generation technology. The next question I get asked is, where do I start? I'm an enterprise. What's my starting point? How do I get on this journey? So it all starts with having a clear AI strategy. You need to be able to take your use cases and put them on a three-dimensional matrix. One is impact. If I do this use case, what kind of impact am I going to generate? Second one is my ability to execute. Do I have all the ingredients to execute this use case? Do I have all the requirements, the right model, the right data to do this scenario? Third, often forgotten but very important, is what is my risk? Am I going to get sued because I'm doing this? Is it ahead of its time? If you take your use cases, put them along those three dimensions, you'll be very clear very soon what are the top 3-4 use cases that you want to jump in with. Almost all SIs, strategy consulting firms now have a practice that does that pretty much, help you figure out where to start, what use cases to pick up for trying generative AI. Once you have use cases, this is one universal truth. Unless you have the data platform, generative AI is not going to be transformative for you in your company. More often than not, for most of the use cases where you're fundamentally changing your business process, you need to train the model with your data. I'm not talking about creating a brand new LLM from scratch that's very expensive, but there are other techniques. There are fine-tuning techniques like adapter tuning, where you can take the LLM, create an adapter layer with your data, your tuned data, and make sure the LLM is performing to your specifications. You can only do that if you have a data foundation. So one of the first parts of generating this generative AI journey for customers is getting your data platform figured out. Right? Making sure your data is in one place, it's in one format, can be read by the LLM model for adapter tuning. That's a lot of effort. And that is where it's absolutely essential to do this. Once you have the data, the next element is obviously change management. It brings a new set of IT skill sets into the fore that are not common. It's not just data science, by the way. I talked about this. For enterprises to run in production, you need MLOps or LLM ops, a new science altogether. You need prompt engineering. You need have their new kind of set of skills that you need as an organization that you need to develop. And of course, there's change management element as well. When you're doing mass scale changes by completely redoing the marketing process and how you create a new marketing campaign, you have a ton of change management that goes with it as well. And most importantly, you probably need an ecosystem of partners, be it SIs, to help you. Content partners become incredibly important in the AI journey, given how important it is for data, having the right data to train your model. The content partners are hugely important. There's a whole ecosystem of new companies coming together to create the test data, to label the test data, to dedupe the test data. There's a new crop of things that you need to worry about. Bottom line, once you get all of that, the reward at the end of the day is phenomenal. That's the key message. But you need to look at the risks, and you need to have the right things in place, like your data foundation, like your responsible AI framework, like your talent for the right level to be able to do this. So in closing, I think my key message to you is GenAI is not about a single LLM, ours or someone else's. It's all about the platform at enterprise level. Consumer is a completely different discussion. Things like data governance, making sure my data never gets leaked and I don't get sued are so fundamental. It's almost a non-starter if you don't have this. You know, it's an open secret in the GenAI world, given all the hype, given all the value statements, you still have a problem. There are a large number of POCs, but very few in production. And this is an open statement. Everyone will acknowledge this. The reason is companies are still figuring out how to deal with this enterprise risk. As a consumer, I just want to plan my trip to Italy. That's a different ballgame. But as an enterprise, if you're going to get sued because you use GenAI, that's going to fundamentally ruin your company, basically. So that is the key message. And that's where we are focusing on. The whole Vertex platform is meant to do that, to give you that on-ramp for enterprises. Hope that was clear. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be around for the next 1 hour, 2 hours. If there's more questions, happy to take them. As I said, I left out a lot of technical detail. I didn't want to bore you with the depth of the discussion. But if anyone is interested, wants me to go into a little bit more details on RAG or grounding, happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you. All your presenters today are going to be Indian, so just get used to it. So, Rayn, thank you for the session. Rayn and I used to work together at Google. So you alluded to this a few times, but I think it's good to maybe get a little bit deeper. The blending of public LLMs and private LLMs is a big question. A lot of companies have their own data. They want to protect it, but they want to run models. How do they go about doing that? What's the process? You talked about your cycle, but that probably is one of the biggest questions people ask is how not only protect it, but how do I leverage it?
Great question. So the LLMs that are given by a provider, OpenAI, Microsoft, or us, or anyone else, any open source model, it's a starting point, a great starting point. But for most of the enterprise use cases, that's not enough because you want it to go out of your proprietary data and the current data, not a data 1 year back. So this whole concept of public versus private comes up. The way I would address that, first of all, creating a new LLM from scratch, large language model from scratch, is a very expensive, time-consuming process. We recommend that in very, very few cases. You need tremendous amounts of data, tremendous amount of compute resources, armies of data science folks, a lot of reinforced learning. To get to a private LLM from scratch is a very hard journey, and it's not recommended for everyone. There are few companies that have scale and ability to do that. Certainly you could do that. Then what is the realistic solution? The realistic solution is this technology called fine-tuning, and the way we implement in Google is adapter tuning. So you take the LLM, you train the LLM that we provide, our PaLM model, with your data on top. What it does is it creates an adapter on top of our LLM with your data, which, by the way, sits in your tenant. It never comes to Google. So when there is a runtime query, it goes through the adapter, gets deciphered, and if it needs to make a call to the main model, it does. What this does is it allows you to bring your data, your context, into the LLM journey. Now, not every scenario would need that. I mean, if a simple scenario like voice translation, image generation, the out-of-the-box LLM should be good, wherever you got it from, Google or otherwise, that would do it. But if you have to train it with your data, our recommended approach for most customers is the adaptive tuning layer.
Perfect. So one more question that I definitely want to open it up to the group. So look, I've been here for 30 plus years. I have never seen, and some of us were talking in the back, the speed at which AI has been adopted and has been talked about from an investor perspective, from a consumer perspective, from, frankly, an entrepreneur perspective. How much of this is hype that's going to, take its course versus how much of it is truly transformational? And what we see today is just the beginning of the massive next wave.
Great question, Avanish. Google's belief that it is a transformational technology. Yes, there is hype, but the core technology has a lot of power, has a lot of applicability for most use cases. What I talked about, creating code from scratch, creating new content from scratch, all these are great use cases. So a lot of this is real. I mean, as shown by McKinsey or the Nielsen research that I showed, the productivity gains, those are all real numbers. So I'm not worried about that being a hype. I think it's the right technology. It's once in a generation technology, and everyone should look at it and see how they implement it. The real question is the implementation challenge. When I implement this, as I said before, I don't want to have an Italian government moment or a Samsung moment. That is where, how do I control my enterprise risk? How do I select a partner who I can trust with this journey? So one of the questions that I get asked is, if Google is so sure about your training data, your large language model, how can I buy into that? So a few weeks back, in fact, a couple of weeks back, Avanish, we introduced this publicly. We said we are going to indemnify the users from our models, meaning if you ever get sued, it's Google, not you. That's a big statement. We indemnify on two fronts. By the way, we are the only one in the industry that does it at both levels. One is indemnification of the training data that went into LLM. That's not you doing it. Someone else trained the model for you. OpenAI. We are so confident of the data that we use to train that it is not infringing on anyone's IP, it's not stealing IP from anyone, that we're actually putting our money on it. We're saying we'll indemnify you. This is the data Google, the data that we use to train, we are so confident that we are not breaching any IPs, that we will indemnify customers. The second level of indemnification is the output that's generated by model, that's not breaking anyone's IP, and we indemnify that too. So having those kind of guarantees in place and some of the enterprise risks that I talked about, those are very fundamental in your AI journey. Enterprises, again, everything that I said has an enterprise context.
Hans, no company. Quick question. We talk about generative AI quite a bit. We know that previous to generative AI, there's a lot of machine learning and other, what could be constituted as other forms of AI. Any insights on the other forms, machine learning and other things that we might be wanting to be aware of?
Right.
Since it's got a clearly long history, a lot of application that might be very beneficial for the group to learn about.
Great question. I'm glad you brought it up, Hans. So AI is not new. It's been there for 10 plus years. The previous generation of AI, I call it predictive AI. Why? Because you give it some data and it predicts something to you. But it only knows what it knows. It cannot go think outside the box. It cannot create new content. It can only consume the content that was fed to it. That was the limitation of AI before, the previous journey. That is still very relevant, by the way. If I'm looking for a recommender engine that's going to recommend a product for me on the shopping list, I would still use predictive AI. There's nothing wrong with it. The only thing with predictive AI is it cannot generate new content. Right? The difference with generative AI is now it can think out of the box. It can create new content. That is the advancement. So the previous technologies are still very relevant. For 90% of the business cases, I would still use predictive AI, no doubt. That doesn't go away. But now you have this new tool set which allows you to go beyond. Understand the intent behind. So in the past, you always had technology that would do NLP, natural language processing, right? You could take a document, convert from one language to another language. That existed a lot of time back. What didn't exist is NLU, natural language understanding. It couldn't understand the meaning of what you said, but it can translate for sure in the past. Now you have the ability to do NLU, right? The corollary to your question is, great, we had the era of predictive AI. We are now in the generative AI era. What's next? Where are we headed, right? That's a natural question. I'm sure it comes to your mind. The way researchers are looking at it, and it's still a very new field, everyone is pontificating because this is few years away. I think the next generation, this is what DeepMind founder Sulemia had an article on this. The next generation of AI after generative is going to be interactive, meaning two AI chatbots talking to themselves and making decisions. We're still few years away, so I don't want to scare anyone, but ultimately that's where we see this technology going. Now you have to have massive safeguards in place when that happens. If machines make decisions without even consulting you, you hope those are right decisions. So there is some work to get there, but it was a great question. Thank you for asking.
Thanks so much. Antonio from Infomac. You talk about the adopting a platform, not a model. How to avoid a vendor or platform lock-in?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Great question. This is no different than enterprise software, the way to look at it. It's the same discussion as in enterprise software. In enterprise software world also, you have open source solutions, you have proprietary solutions, and there are good reasons to go to open source. There are good reasons to go to proprietary solutions. You wouldn't want your ERP to be an open source ERP because it's going to take a long time to go make it happen. You'd much rather go to SAP or Oracle as an example, right? Same thing applies in this world. You're going to see plethora of open source models. Natural, it's going to happen. And you're going to have some that are highly tuned, performant for a given use case coming from us, OpenAI, Anthropic. There'll be a few of these providers as well. And as you as consumers, as the CIOs of companies have a choice, right? Is it such a generic use case that I could apply an open source based llama to my situation? Or I need to actually work on drug discovery. I am Mayo Clinic. I'm developing a clinician co-pilot. It needs to be highly specialized. It needs to understand medical ontology. It needs to be trained. Then you would come and use a Google MedPalm. So it's no different in the way you would think, right? Both are possible, but what I said still is applicable. Whether you select a llama or you select a MedPalm, at the end of the day, you need the platform to orchestrate that. You still have MLOps. You still have your testing. You still have your production support processes. Those don't go away. You still need a platform. Now, whether you use a LLM provided by one of the bigger players or you go to open source, that is situation dependent.
I think we're in the beginning of this journey. I have not seen anything take on so quickly. So thank you, Rayn. Thank you, Yogesh, for bringing, I think, a perspective that all of us are still getting our heads around. With that, I think we're good. So let's off to the next, and thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.